What if a major key to you establishing the foundations of memory so that you can unlock deeper states of calm and perhaps even experience the kinds of enlightenment described in many ancient traditions can only be found by navigating the intersection between science and what you might call spirituality, but not quite. There's so many interesting nuances, and in our time, in order to have the best possible memory that we can, we need to navigate this world that's constantly changing and understand how it fits in our brains and how that we can really make sure that we are seizing upon the present moment, being mindful, even to the point of being maybe mindful geeks, and doing it in a way that really enables us to enjoy all of the chaos, all of the pleasure, and maybe even being distanced from it so that we can truly enjoy it. And to that end, you and I today are sitting down with Michael Taft, a renowned meditation expert, author of The Mindful Geek, and host of the extraordinary Deconstructing Yourself podcast. Michael is an incredible speaker and researcher and interviewer about many, many mystical and meditative and practical science angles to mindfulness. And as he reminds us today, mindfulness and memory are essentially the same thing. So his keen interest in memory techniques blew me away when he emailed me about them. And I was so happy to hear from him. And then what happened next is amazing. And, he talks about how he revived certain older things he had already memorized very, very quickly by using the Memory Palace practice and then memorizing some new things. And so I just thought it would be a wonderful thing for you to hear Michael's history with using memory techniques, how he came into them, how he's been able to use them in different ways, and basically enjoy a new understanding of the Memory Palace technique. And this is very exciting for me to listen to, especially since there's a range of experiences and different ways that he does it. However, in order to get to these states of deep peace and fulfillment and maybe even enlightenment, one thing surprised me above all, and that is that it might not all be roses in the end. And I asked Michael about the potential dark sides of meditation, which maybe can be accelerated by the profundity of what memory training can do for you at these higher or at least more integral and focused levels. And I think you'll find how he talks about it surprising as well, but also very useful as we wrestle with the tension between so-called woo-woo and the rising scientific validation of many so-called spiritual practices. And we'll explore how to combat things like topic exhaustion, because when you're memorizing lots and lots of mantras, especially very, very difficult ones and challenging ones, it can really burn you out. And so how are you going to keep yourself fresh? No matter how long you've been at something, no matter how good you get at it, you really can get exhausted. So how do you keep balanced and keep moving forward? If you like these kinds of conversations, hit that thumbs up, get subscribed, because this channel is all about challenging everybody's assumptions, including my own, as we dive deeper and deeper into the layers of memory, memory-based meditation practice, and all things mindful, to the point of being mindful geeks. Michael, thanks so much for joining me to discuss your interest in using the memory techniques I'm so passionate about, such as the Memory Palace, but not only the techniques, but for also purposes that I'm passionate about, which have to do with memorizing mantras. And then I assume some sort of goal is in the mix of what those mantras are going to do or potentially do once they are memorized. So maybe just a bit about yourself and your interest in the memory tradition for these purposes.
Thanks, Anthony. I'm really pleased to talk with you today. It's been really fun to get to know you through your books and your videos, and also, from some of our conversations and stuff. And I've actually, gotten a lot out of the stuff you're teaching. So I really appreciate that. So you're asking about kind of the background. I'm one of those weirdos that, like, even in junior high school, I'd memorize song lyrics and then recite them to myself as I'm walking to school. It's back when we walked to school.
Right.
But it was just fun for me to recite memorized lyrics and then correct them, and then do it with longer and longer songs and more songs, and then eventually poetry. So I've always been kind of like that. So I am a little bit of a memorizer of that sort, a literature memorizer to begin with. And it always has to be stuff I like. It's never just like memorizing the sequence of buttons or so. I can't stand anything like that. It's got to be something I love and have a reason to memorize. But it's over time it started to come together where I was learning more and more interesting literature with more and more like sort of maybe traditional spiritual stuff, and starting to memorize that and finding that to be really fun and powerful. And my kind of personal story is that in my high school years, I was plagued with extremely bad anxiety, like immobilizing anxiety. And back then, we're talking the 70s, there's no help available for that. No one knew what it's just like, what are you going to do, So I just was searching because it was really very bad. And so even though I was like, for example, getting decent grades in school and able to function, in a lot of ways I kind of wasn't. And so back then, I started looking at everything I could read. And one of the things I found were like magic books, sort of like Llewellyn publisher, like magic books like that. And some of them had, I think one was an astral projection book, and it had meditation techniques in there, particularly what I would now call yoga nidra techniques of body relaxation and stuff. And I tried it out, and I was like, wait a minute, this is really lowering my anxiety a lot, So wait a minute, something's relieving the pain here. And so I really started getting into it, and then getting into yoga, and then getting into meditation. And so once I was really into that, especially in Indian traditions, in Asian traditions, there's, I guess, just like in Western traditions, Western religious traditions, there's just so much hymns and prayers and what we would call stotrams and mantras and all that available, tantras, shastras, all of that kind of stuff. And it's powerful, and it's all in some other language. And for me, what, my area of study in university was foreign languages. I just like foreign languages. And so it's always the case that I just wanted to memorize it in the original language. And so I'm used to memorizing stuff in foreign languages, at least a little bit, not like a lot, but certain things for sure. And I noticed that that being able, whenever I wanted to just pop off a long stotram in Sanskrit in my head was really useful, really calming, really focusing, really energizing, felt good. It's just kind of a wonderful practice. So I guess that's a little bit of an intro.
Excellent. So with magic, this is something I'm vaguely familiar with in terms of, magic with a K and so forth. And often in these books, they include some sort of meditative practice. Also, there seems to be often a symbolic element where they may make the space have a shrine, for example, and other ways of arranging space with acknowledging the north and the east and the south and the west and so forth. Did you go into that aspect of it, or was it mostly the mental and body stuff that you were interested in?
I did a lot of that, and I ran into something interesting that people used to run into back then, which was, there's all these different systems of doing this, and they completely disagree with each other. Therefore, maybe there's something arbitrary about it, but at the same time, as long as you're in one system and use it, then it starts to work, and you're not trying to get it to jive with other systems, and so based on that, so a lot of people at that time ended up creating chaos magic for that very reason. Like, well, if anything will work, then let's build our own system and then get into that. I went the other way, which is like, well, in the West, all those systems are broken, the lineages are broken, but in Asia, they're not. You can find teachers who, unbroken lineages for thousands of years, where the kind of like breadth and depth of the practice hasn't been lost, or forgotten, or whatever, or eradicated. And so I ended up really getting, for that reason, doing it more in the Hindu and Buddhist spheres, where visualizing stuff is a big part of it, at least a big part of it, and arranging space and concern about the directions, and all these features are in there. Setting up ritual spaces that have stuff in arranged in certain ways. All of that.
Right. So I ask about that because, in a sense, those are, in my mind, a kind of memory palace. I wouldn't impose the word memory palace on them necessarily, but even if we think of the Stations of the Cross or whatever, I mean, there's a deliberate marking of space so that you're offloading the need to remember things onto the actual way the images are located. So is it something like that, or?
There are practices like that. I also think it does another thing, which, if we were to boil it down into like a really reductive, simple idea, is associative memory, where, you come into the special space, and because your brain works on association, now this is the place where I do this stuff. So now I'm in the mood to do that stuff. Right. So there's some of that. And the more special and different you make the space, the bigger the shift is. Right. Because it just triggers all the memories. So yeah, there's a lot of that. And there's also really interesting temple systems. If you get into how the temples are constructed, they're very, on these kind of spatial principles, something like what we in the West might call, with the Chinese name feng shui, but in India it's called Vastu Shastra. And so there's principles of how you arrange all that. But the memory stuff, the thing that is mainly relied on is just that meditating gives you a better memory.
Right.
Your mind is just a little clearer and a little sharper. And so most of traditional practice is about having memorized a lot of stuff.
Right.
You just have it there because you've memorized it.
Right. So in terms of you coming into getting interested in memory palaces, I think you probably already knew that long before you heard of my stuff. But what's the sort of before and after, or the genesis of us getting together to?
Yeah, it's my favorite guy, Robert Anton Wilson. Who I was reading way back then, and ended up, just career-wise being able to meet him in the late 90s and do a long interview with him. I think that it was published by Sounds True, but I think it's been also kind of released into the wild on YouTube. It's like a 6-hour interview with him. Really fun, amazing experience to get to hang out with him. But in any case, in talking about Giordano Bruno and talking about Western esoteric traditions, which he, of course, was very interested in, he brought up memory palaces. And he described it as, you build an interior temple that houses all this information. And it was very cool. But it was missing something. I couldn't get it to work. I thought this is the most fascinating thing in the world. I remember in about, like, I'm going to just make up a probably very accurate number, like let's say 1988 or something, going like, okay, I'm gonna do the memory palaces, and I'm gonna, try it out, and I couldn't make it work. And so I gave up on it for all these years. But then when I saw your stuff, I'm like, well, this guy's talking about memory palaces. Let's see what he has to say. And also the fact that you're into stuff like Neubauten and a whole bunch of other references you have. I'm like, oh, we like the same stuff. So that made me just more interested and able to, I'm like, let's see what this guy's talking about. And you gave the key that unlocked it for me, which was you don't make up a new building that doesn't exist. Right? Like use something. So, because then you're just having to memorize that. It's like use a building you already know. I hadn't thought of like using my house. And did you, I mean, that's how I remember you saying it. Maybe you're like going, I never said it, but that's how it works for me.
Right or wrong, I've said it in so many different ways that it'd almost be impossible for me not to have said that in that way. But yeah, the real location thing is quite a game changer for people who have struggled with. You can invent memory palaces, but a lot of people just struggle with it, and there's reasons why. So,
well, at least the reason for me was that then I just have to memorize the memory palace, and I hadn't got to that place yet. Whereas using a real location, all of a sudden, I was like, oh, there's been this thing that I used to know it pretty well, but I've always wanted to get back into it and rememorize it. So let's just try that because it should be pretty easy because I kind of already know it pretty well. So I just set it up around my house. But we're talking like overnight it was memorized, but it was something that I already kind of knew. Mm-hmm. But I was really surprised how fast it worked. And also I was really surprised how much fun I was having doing. I'm sorry, I can't remember your sort of like term for it, but you know, when you bounce back and forth on the stations.
Right. Recall rehearsal. Yeah.
Recall rehearsal. That was actually literally fun as a concentration game, like just to sit there and so I had fun doing it, but also I was like, I noticed that it made like the net of the memory be like suddenly really strong. And so between the real location and the recall rehearsal, I was instantly, okay, there's another thing I want to remember that's much harder. It's like tongue twister Sanskrit. It's many, 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 many verses. Let's try that. And again, it's something I've recited for a long time, so it's not that it was new to me. But okay, so I laid it out on the same house, and which I know maybe if I do that enough, it'll start bleeding through. I don't know.
It can do, yeah.
But I laid it out in the same building, and then that took. It wasn't overnight. That took a few days. But again, it was a few days of fun, and I'm a busy guy. I have a lot of work to do. It's not like I just have time to sit around memorizing stuff. I was doing this here and there while I was eating dinner and doing other difficult things. But just like, okay, now the next station, now the next station, now the next station, and then doing recall rehearsal. And again, even the recall rehearsal was acting as a concentration practice that I really was enjoying. It's really fun to have, strong concentration. And so doing that in those different orders, and it just came together very, very fast. And there was only one or two spots, again, because I had heard the words enough, there was only one or two spots where I needed to use, again, what's your term? It would be magnetic imagery.
Right.
Just there. Most of it, I had heard it enough that if I could start the sentence right, I'd remember it. So, but a few spots, it was like, oh, magnetic image here and there. And so that really, I'm like, since then, every day I recite those, right? And it's been many months, it's just very fun to sit down and recite them. And I've really gotten a lot out of that. So I really, really appreciate it. But now I'm working on stuff that I don't have a history of having recited. Mm. And it takes longer, but not much longer. And I'm also using the magnetic imagery more because it's like, oh, it locks it in place a lot better. Right. And so in the way I've been working, I didn't use that much because I didn't need to. But now I'm seeing, oh, I need to use it. Let's see how well it works. Oh, it's immediate recall because of the magnetic image. So, the thing I'm working on now is in Avadi, so it's like medieval Hindi. It's like, it's a foreign language, and it's there's one nice thing about Sanskrit is it's so almost like technical and intense. It's got a lot of handholds, whereas this medieval Hindi isn't like that. It's kind of all the words kind of sound similar, and so it's a little harder in a certain way. But with the magnetic images, it's like instead of trying to remember it, I let go and let the images flash by, and it just comes out. And I'm like, oh, it's like a different mood. I'm relaxing, and it's coming out instead of focusing and kind of muscling my way through it, if you see what I mean. Mm-hmm. It's like you just see. Like you, I don't have a trouble coming up with the magnetic images. That's really easy. And they're really loose. They don't match the language that well, but it's close enough. Yeah. That it's like, it gets it going. And I think part of it isn't even that it sounds that much like it. It's just an odd image that reminds me of the sequence of the words. So I'm just ranting on here. I'll stop for a minute.
No. I mean, to me, it's preaching to the converted, but for others, they may be surprised to know that, I mean, one thing that fascinates and interests me is that you would have quite an easy time reviving or re-memorizing something you already knew, because when I have to re-memorize something, which happens from time to time, I find it just very difficult and tedious. And I don't know, that's because the ego comes up and is just like angry at myself because I forgot it in the first place, or it got into disrepair. But I find that quite challenging to re-memorize things. I actually can only think of musical examples where I've let like a Bach piece fade into disrepair or whatever, but having to re-memorize it is just such a grind. So I'm enthused and inspired to find projects where I could actually enjoy re-memorizing, but that may be an option for many people that they haven't even thought of, to revive something they used to know as a project.
Yeah, I'm curious, in your case, what about that is harder? What makes it harder? Is it just that you feel annoyed that you lost it?
Well, I'm trying to psychoanalyze myself here. Like, what is the big deal? It shouldn't be that big of a deal. But it certainly happened with quotes, or I'll notice in a German thing that like there's a quote that I really like, but sometimes I just really drop the grammar for some reason. So it's like du kannst dich für deinem Freund nicht schon genug putzen, right? It's got to be du kannst dich, like it has to be, you can't for your friend, make yourself beautiful enough or dress yourself appropriately enough. And so because I often drop this dish, or I drop certain things that need to be there, then I have to like, why? Well, first of all, why is it getting dropped? And then second of all, what am I going to do to fix it? And I think maybe part of it is that I just don't accept the way the grammar works or something. I can't really explain it, but it is this kind of thing where I find a little bit of resistance in having to go and work it out.
A little bit of a block.
Yeah. Well, I have no fantasy of ever ridding myself of all blocks, but that does kind of segue into some things I wanted to ask you about.
Oh, great.
And since that you've studied for so long, and your podcast is an incredible resource, and I have here Mindful Geek, so take the opportunity to ask you some things. And one thing that is on my mind has to do with this kind of blocks and resistances, because I found that I got quite satiated with my own Sanskrit memorization. And I've done bits and pieces out of order in Atmabodha, but there's just almost like, this is now too much. And do I have to take a break or what? So I'm off memorizing a very strange poetic text in English, and it's very challenging and hard, and it's revived my practice. But
what is it? What's the strange poetic text?
Well, there's two. One is called Eunoia, and the other is called Xenotext.
Nice.
And have you heard of these?
No, I think I've heard of Xenotext actually, but
well, you'll love Eunoia. Like, I'll just give you a smattering here so you can hear the complexity of it, or at least it's complex to me.
Yes.
Awkward grammar appalls a craftsman. A data bard as daft as Zara damns stagnant art, and scrawls in alpha a slapdash arc and a backward slash that mars all stanzas and jams all ballads. What a scandal. Anyway, it goes on.
Wow. That sounds hard to memorize.
It is hard. And one of the things that makes it hard, I believe, is because every word that I just said has only one vowel, which is the vowel A.
Wow.
And then when you get to the I part, it's like writing is inhibiting. Sighing I sit, scribbling in ink this pigeon script. Disciplining signs with trifling gimmicks. Impish hijinks which highlight stick sigils. Isn't it glib? Isn't it chic? Like every word only has the vowel I in the I section of the poem. It's like,
who's the author?
This is Christian Book. So B-O umlaut K. Anyway, the Xenotext is some of it is simpler to memorize because it doesn't have that vowel constraint, but it's not just a poem. He's literally injecting the poetry into deathless bacteria for placement on satellites that will go out and perhaps escape the heat death of the sun.
That's why I've heard of it. Yeah.
Anyway, Xenotext Part 2 is coming out later this year. So the second book in the series is coming out. Anyway, it's just wild stuff. But so that has helped, revive my ongoing interest in memorizing stuff. But what I really wanted to ask you about was, I also have this feeling, and it may be a resistant feeling, but I have this feeling that I'm not going to find another mindfulness gem or another spiritual gem just by memorizing more Sanskrit. So it seems like a wall of arrogance to think, oh no, there will be nothing left for me to find in these ancient traditions, which I don't think, but I don't know that I will find it just merely by memorizing more stuff in Sanskrit. So I don't know. I just wanted to bounce that back on you and see, because I know you know a lot about computation, and I think a lot about recursion. And so I wonder if the set of sets at some point is sort of reached and it just bounces back on itself. And you really are playing a fool's game thinking, oh, there's enlightenment somewhere in these interlocking Sanskrit phrases that will now take me to the next level, the next plateau. And I don't want to give up if that's the case, but it just feels like, yeah, I can gradually memorize more Sanskrit as I please, but not with treasure hunt, when probably I got Advaita Vedanta, I got its point, sort of thing. So now maybe go on to the next thing.
Yeah, no, there's a lot there in what you're saying. The first thing I'll say is that after that second long Sanskrit hymn, technically it's a stotram, right? Mm-hmm. Translated as hymn. I was like, okay, on to the next one. It's this even harder Sanskrit. I couldn't do it. I mean, I bounced off it like just a tennis ball off a brick wall. I could not make myself memorize the first line. Right. And I tried hard, like day after day after day. And I finally recognized, I'm like, my brain can't do another one right now. I think it just needed a break. Right. Because there's something very intense about doing this. Like I was saying, even when I was doing the rehearsal, it was like I was going into a state, like a deep concentrated state. And I could tell like afterwards that I felt really good, but also like I needed a rest, And so I think just on the level of, let's say, brain chemistry, you just need a rest. But also, if I were to get into the woo end of it, I think these things are very powerful, and they're rearranging our internal energy system, and so you need a rest. But by rest, I mean from memorizing new ones. Reciting it, on the other hand, over and over is very good. Like using
that, I maintain.
Yeah. That's what I mean. Like that's where the energy's coming from. And then, but I notice now. And this is like several months later. I needed a break of a long time. It's coming back around. Like I started memorizing a thing again, and I'm like, oh, there it is. So it just took time, and I think part of it is actually about the energy of these actual texts. At least on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I think that. Tuesday and Thursday, I'm like, who knows? But you're right that it's not just like let's memorize all the things, because there are so many. There's an infinite number. If you just want, let's say you just wanted just because the Ribu Gita, that's some Ramana Maharshi stuff. Even if you just wanted to go with texts that Ramana Maharshi mentioned, that's a lot of work. There's a shit ton of them, right? There's a lot, and that's just one little tiny fragment of one little tradition, one big tradition. So, what I have found happens is that certain texts reach out to me. Like, they can all be interesting, just like because I love to read. They can all be powerful because they're filled with cool stuff. But some of them are like, no, you want to work with me. And so I think it's not so much about memorizing all the things, but like actually following the angel in the library and just kind of going from text to text to text and see which ones have that really intriguing quality where you can tell there's something there.
Right.
I mean, the traditions would say all you need is one, and then you just recite it all the time, and that will do that will have the spiritual awakening effect. But even the people who say that seems like they know a lot of material. Do you ever watch the YouTube channel of Nishnath? I'm just going to tell his channel name is Nish the Fish. I can't think of it. He's a young guy from India who lives in LA and is like studying philosophy, but he's a lifelong family. His family are tantric practitioners, and so he's been using Sanskrit texts his whole life, and he's got zillions of them memorized. Right? Seems like he's reciting them from memory often, at least big portions of them. Now, part of it is he's probably recited a lot, but a lot of it is just that's the tradition. So, in other words, even though one is enough, very often people end up knowing a bunch of them, and getting there's different ones that appeal for different situations or different times of the year. They just will speak to you, And some of them, another part of them is that people aren't always in the same mood. Like you're doing Ribu Gita, right? That's the mood of the formless. And my mind, I don't know about you, but my mind isn't always in the mood of the formless. Sometimes I want to work with form. And once you start working with form, there's different forms for different moods and stuff like that. So, that starts being interesting to I'm this particular Shiva thing is really cool and beautiful. It seems to have some energy and be talking to me. Let me start working with that. And again, I wouldn't probably start out by memorizing. I'd start out by reciting it a bit for a few days and see how it feels, And then if there's really a link there, the resistance will drop, and it'll start being like, oh, I wanna get to know this better. I want to get to know this more deeply. But I certainly, just to repeat, it's like after doing one, the resistance was very high. Even though I couldn't believe it, because my excitement level about doing another one was 11, and my confidence was 11, and I'm like, yeah, I'm diving in. But some part of my mind was like, no, you're not. Just not even one sentence. No, you're not. So,
right. Yeah, that's interesting. That's helpful. Speaking of woo, I should send you, if you like. Today from Nest Labs, they had the woo spectrum, and it included an exercise where you can actually help yourself find out where you are on the woo spectrum. But it's interesting, like times are changing. There's witchcraft at major universities now, or I've seen that at least one university. I shouldn't exaggerate, but it's like things are changing a little bit. And what is that? What does that say about culture? We've had a pretty hard materialism in many, many ways for the last couple of decades, and it seems to have tapped out. What do you think's going on?
I think that it has its obvious advantages, and it's also, now that we've culturally experimented with that for long enough, we've also seen the limitations, and that the fact that there's a whole bunch of stuff that it doesn't cover well, covers in a very bad way, and a whole bunch of other stuff, a vast array of stuff that it doesn't cover at all, just has nothing to say about it. And so while it's useful and powerful and interesting and potentially wrong in some ways, it's also limited. And it's time to look past the limitations. And I think people know it. I'm a bad one to talk about it because I started out in the woo zone and very deeply, and am quite intuitive and have a lot of experiences like that. But for some reason, I'm just good at learning science stuff. So I ended up, doing the work for science at the college level, all the science precursors in college, and also getting very, very, very interested in neuroscience in the early aughties, and you see the book Mindful Geek as a result of that, where I'm really in that mode of having learned all of that. So it's like that was a big foray into real hard science for me, and I really loved it. But I can't deny my own experience that much, and my own experience is just weird enough that it doesn't fall into any category. Even the woo categories, right? Even if you let go of hard materialism into, well, here's the systems and stuff, it doesn't really, even that kind of doesn't explain it. I really like Jeffrey Kripal's work, if you're familiar with that, where he's an interesting character, teaches at Brown, maybe somewhere in Texas, his speaking of witchcraft in colleges, his whole thing is kind of like weird studies, Yeah.
Oh, is that related to that podcast that has a name like that, Weird Studies?
Yeah.
Okay.
No, sorry. I thought you meant a different thing. It's his point is that even all the systems for understanding the weird aren't weird enough. It's just, it's like there's stuff that cannot be put in that kind of way, and it's just our brains aren't set up to understand it systematically. And so what I've learned over a long period of time is to be very conceptually agnostic. Really, really, and like open to anything, but also open to seeing the flaws in anything, and holding it all really lightly. It's just concepts,
Yeah, that's a good position to be in, and I see tremendous balance, which I think is admirable and almost an image as a goal to chase after, that balance where you are scientifically informed, but also informed by experience. Which there's a part of the Mindful Geek that leapt out at me that I think relates to this, maybe indirectly, which was a part where you were talking about loneliness and isolation, and how, if I understood it correctly, there's a kind of like a contradiction where you would really, really want to have a good social structure in order for the brain to be as plump and responsive as possible. But failing that, you could meditate in particular ways that would compensate. But I don't know that I fully understood it, because it almost seems contradictory. But that would be something like a meta loving kindness meditation, I guess, where you would reflect on other people and send them goodwill, etc.
That's one example. Another one is again counterintuitive, but backed by a lot of studies, and that is, you would think that in order to be good at understanding other people's feelings, you need to go out and hang out with a lot of other people and talk with them and interact a lot, and sort of learn. And in one way you do. But of course, that's, incredibly helpful. But in another way, it turns out that, for example, doing Vipassana style meditation on your own emotions over and over again, your paying attention to somebody's feelings. And so the part of your brain that, pays attention to feelings still gets bigger because you're a person and you're having feelings and you're paying attention to them. And so when you then, by doing that, you're training on, again, paying attention to how emotions arise. And so it turns out when you do a bunch of that and then you go out and you interact with people, that part of your brain is doing pretty good. It's able to, it has grown through your practice, and now you can read others better as well. And part of what makes that work is that is micro expressions. The fact that when we are trying to understand what another person's feeling, we see their expressions and we very briefly play them out on our own face and body. So we take that on a little bit, a very minor version of it very quickly. And but if you've been meditating on your own body sensations of emotion, right? This is sort of James Lang theory type emotion, where it's the body sensation part of it, right? And you got really good at it. You spent a lot of time at it. Your interoceptive faculties have gotten very sensitive. Your insular cortices are large. When you play those out very briefly, so someone has an expression and just automatically, this is just what humans do. We are unconscious that we're doing it. We play it out on our own flesh. You've trained yourself to read that very, very quickly and very sensitively. And so you're better at it. And so that's why it's not just magic. It's like you've been training reading how you're feeling, and then when you imitate another person's feelings, you read it really well. And so it turns out you can, so the paradoxical thing, can you sit alone in a room and learn to read people's emotions better? It turns out to be yes, because you're a people, right? Right. And they did some interesting studies that showed the mechanism here, which was they're like, well, what about people whose faces can't imitate others? And where can we get a bunch? It's always like, well, where do we get a bunch of those people for free for our study? And it turns out there's a readily available population of women using Botox, and which freezes your facial muscles, so you can't do micro expressions because your face is frozen. And so they did a big study with women using Botox versus women with no Botox, and lo and behold, they only tested for empathy. The empathy was drastically reduced because they couldn't feel their own face. So that idea of micro expressions was really demonstrated there. But then they tried the opposite thing just to make sure. And so that would be hard. Like, do you make your expressions bigger? Well, they're unconscious. So in the sense of, you're not doing them on purpose. So how do you make them bigger? And the solution was, you don't make them bigger, you make them feel bigger. And so what they did was put the equivalent, some substance on these people's faces, but the gist of it was like a mud mask. And if you put mud mask on your face, how every little like smile or grimace feels really big, right? Because there's something about having the mud mask on that amplifies the sensation. And so it's like, okay, so the naive volunteers versus the mud mask people. It wasn't really mud, it was some other stuff. But anyway, the mud mask people. And it turned out the mud mask people who could feel their facial sensations way more clearly had much higher empathy.
Right.
So, in other words, it's very clearly demonstrated that we're doing a thing when we're feeling how other people feel, and that you can get better at reading that in a whole bunch of ways. You could walk around with a mud mask on, and then you'd be good at it, or by training on your own, mindful meditation, by doing vipassana on your own physical expressions of emotion, you get way better at it. It's interesting stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Well, part of the reason why it came to mind is just this idea of the shift into more openness to, say, spiritual topics and so forth. And people seem to be, well, at least in some groups, I've seen some research recently that, younger men are now choosing to become Catholics again and go to Catholic church in a big enough wave that it's reported on whatever dials that sociologists and psychologists are studying to make that observation. So, it's just an interesting factor there with loneliness, and maybe the meditators can get away with it, not going to church.
Well, or the other thing, which is you go to church and meditate. So, if I were interested in becoming a Catholic, which I'm not, but I'm interested in Catholicism and its practices, I would start memorizing the Latin, of some really important prayers, and then go and do that together with other guys. And I think I think I can predict very confidently, although I'm often wrong, that people would get a lot out of that, like do novenas in Latin together or something like that.
In what I was reading, they tend to be choosing the Latin Mass as well, which is very interesting as well. Well, the other big thing that was on my mind to ask you about, and I'm not going to, I'll put it in a story, but I'm not going to name the text only because I don't want anybody to not read this person's text. But and it blends together with an increasing concern about the quote unquote dark side of meditation, which I think I remember you addressed briefly in Mindful Geek as well. And I kind of have strange feelings about it. I mean, I get it. The dark night of the soul can be very destabilizing and all of that. But what happened to me, and this is now back in maybe 2021, early 2021, is I read a particular text. I memorized some of the names for stations on the body. I don't know that they're supposed to be sacras or what chakras. I think you have to instead of cha to really get the Sanskrit. But I don't know that they're explicitly there. But that's part of the problem is I was being a little bit fast and loose and just memorizing stuff I didn't totally understand. And you were mentioning maybe just chant it first before you memorize it. Anyway, what ended up happening is I, out of nowhere, had a massive revisitation of a earlier issue I had around heights that I totally healed somehow. And then it plagued me for the rest of the time that I lived in this apartment, wow. Which, high places, fear and all that sort of stuff is quite intense. And then when you get rid of it, it's wild. Like I couldn't even believe that I was able to live on the 8th floor for so many years, but it seemed to have come from this particular practice. And then, I'm thinking too of Cheetah House that has emerged in the last couple of years where people are having wild and confronting experiences from meditation. They have someone to go talk to or whatnot, which I think is really good. But I don't know what when you put together the neuroscientific knowledge that we have, and then think about this woo spectrum, I can't square it. Like I was deeply disturbed, and I wasn't settled again until I got a house on the ground. It's really wild, and I just don't know what's going on with that.
Yeah, the thing is that I feel like, especially the way mindfulness was brought into Western culture, which was through, the Buddhist community trying to secularize it. And you see the Mindful Geek is, that's a highly secularized book. But I think there was a kind of naive assumption that it's always all good. It's always all good, and that most of the criticism of that was all around, well, you're not bringing in the, moral principles, and so the ethical principles are left behind, and so, but come on, the ethical principles boil down to don't be a dick, right? Like just be nice. They're not hard. They're not complex moral principles. It's like, don't steal, don't kill, stuff that I feel is not that unique to the tradition, and of course, very important, but at the same time, not the reason that things are going off the rails. I think the reason that things are going off the rails is that, uh, well, it's complex because everyone's different, right? But is that we don't have a network of practitioners. We don't have, strong bonds with teachers who are working with us one-on-one. We don't have a sangha, like other people we're practicing with who who are informed and can really help us. And furthermore, I think a lot, and this is a big one, a lot of the practices are meant for monks, and they're meant for people who are in a monastic community and who are supported by other monastics who've been doing this for years. And also, and this is very crucial, the kind of community where if you go off the rails for a while, you're held up by the community. Like, oh, every once in a while you kind of lose your shit for 2 weeks, but we're used to that.
Right.
And so we have these sorts of practices, and we left all that behind. There's still some sangha, there's still teachers, but it's not that kind of like deep social support for those sorts of practices. And so, especially, I would really point out that for many people doing real high concentration stuff, where it starts to get into very altered state material, that can be, I would avoid that unless you've got a lot of support.
Right.
It's super high concentration, which is great. It feels great most of the time, but it also can reveal stuff that's been buried that you then don't know how to work with unless you've got a lot of support structure, things like that. So there are, let's just say there's the entire social context of the West where, like, if you can't sound like a normal person and work today, we have to warehouse you somewhere and probably put you on drugs, does not really support the range of expression that can come up here. And I also, that's just the normal, not getting into the woo end of it, where it's like, like you might need some energetic protection.
Right.
And that can be really important. And so if that's of interest, there's a really great podcast called The Emerald. And there's an episode of The Emerald that is called like on guardianship and protectors, or that's close to the title anyway.
Yeah.
And, just listen to that. Or I'm speaking to the audience, it's like, sometimes there's, even if it's all imaginary, there's something psychologically helpful about the protection practices that are there in every tradition we find. They're always there. And even some of the stuff I've memorized, some of the verses and hymns and stuff, are technically protection practices. Now, of course, in the non-dual tradition, we, the deep end of that, it's like, well, it's, that assumes there's an other, and people can get dismissive about that. But of course, all these texts have non-dual interpretations as well, where it's about protection from the delusion of your own mind and so on. But I would just, my deep answer is, the Western meditation practitioners need to develop or borrow or re-engineer or somehow get into some protection practices.
Yeah. Now that you mention it, I wonder if my own imagination has built an orthodox conviction in non-duality so strong that when I was playing with this other practice, it just got offended because it's like you no longer, this is a dualistic thing. So, now you will pay, something like that.
Something like that. There's also, it could be that the way that you cured it was kind of like burying it to some extent. And then the practice just unburied it. It found it. And a new type of, I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so and you are, so I'm probably just, but but if my own experience with acrophobia is similar. Sometimes it goes away for years and then suddenly it will return. Sometimes it goes away and then suddenly it will return. And like you were saying, when it returns, it's not funny. Like, it is not pleasant.
No.
Your palms are wet and it's like, whoa, this is terrifying.
Mm.
It's not mild. I think people who don't have it think it's mild. It is like, no, it's like not funny at all.
Mm.
But what I've discovered is that some of these deeper meditation practices, especially on the seeing the spacious emptiness of emotional embodied reaction, really do the trick. That it's like, oh, that actually starts to retrain your brain that there's nothing to be afraid of here, right? And because I live in the Bay Area, so I have to cross lots of bridges all the time. I get a lot of chance to practice that, and so it's like, oh, that's working. Okay, it's there. So I do think there's again, I'm not able to diagnose or prescribe anything, but for me, that really works.
Yeah, no, I just was generally curious because so much of this seems to be imagination and tied in my mind to how the memory techniques work. And then.
And what's the connection for you there? How are they tied?
Well, as I was saying, like, I really went hook, line, and sinker into the non-dual conception, or at least as I wanted to understand it, which is, okay, so if there's only one thing, then there's one thing. And at some point, I just came across this book, which I'll happily mention it privately, but I don't want to scare anybody off that's listening to this, because that's my point. Partly, right, is because the preconceived image can condition what it is that you're going to experience. And I think maybe in this book it even said, like, some terrible things can happen if you don't do this correctly. But why it's tied to memory, I think, is because in memory techniques, at least as I use them and as I understand them to be slightly more effective for a lot of people, is that we don't necessarily know what these processes are doing. We know that, there's semantic memory, or there's the procedural memory element, or there's imagistic or iconic or whatever, like all these words we can use from the science. And we can explain, like, you're using a sound component, you're using a conceptual component or whatever to put an image in a memory palace. But what that's actually doing at the neurochemical level with the nodes of Ranvier and, all this sort of stuff, like, who knows what's in there and what's being released. And then how that the conscious experience is now going to interpret the release of maybe something that's toxic or blissful. I mean, I read it the other way too, because I have last night I had this, so to speak, non-dual experience. And it's just, why is this so intense than the other stuff all of a sudden? And it actually reminded me of some of the ways they represent God in the movies, like just this vortex field in my backyard by a particular plant. And this is, and I've seen these images from the medieval and Renaissance period where there's, like a Hebrew character in a cloud inside a guy's room. And it wasn't like that, but it reminded me of that. And it's just so ultra intense. And I just think sometimes maybe something in my gut just hit my brain. I don't know, not to force materialism on it, but anyway, that's how I relate it to memory techniques, is because I'll remember a certain thing and, have various experiences. And I just wonder what maybe neurochemically being released or locked down or for a future mental experience. I don't know.
I related to that, I think, what's most interesting to me here is love, and maybe even devotion, something like that. But there's something about what we love, we memorize. We get to know it, and we think about it so much, or encounter it so much, or relate to it so much. We tune into it on this level to where it's, if it's a person, we have a big mental model. If it's a text, we've got it, right? And then there's something about reciting it or going through it again that is a kind of devotion practice to what we love, and it feels the heart element of this, not just but like the heart opening part of it, of reciting it and feeling that vibe of just love, devotion, maybe even worship in some cases, is so beautiful, right? It's deeply spiritual. And so to me, the connection between like, okay, here's, even if it's like what you were reciting before, even if it's just a beautiful poem and the love of words and the love of the images and the love and the fact that you're willing to make that a part of your life and then recite it, there's something beautiful going on there. And it's a deep, deep, deep practice. And it's a deep practice in all traditions, even secular traditions. You know, people, I think about the movie about, now my brain is going to fail. Who's the woman writer who killed herself with her head in the oven? Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath. If you see the old Sylvia Plath movie, there's just a scene where she's at like Oxford and they're reciting stuff back and forth to each other from memory, and you just feel the love. They love words. They love the play of it, and there's a kind of reverence there that is just it was playful and fun, but also there's reverence, and so the connection between what we might call spirituality or meditation and memory is very, very deep, very, very deep. And of course, even the word mindfulness, right? That's just a Western translation of the word sati or the word smriti, but the word smriti means memory.
Memory,
right? So there's a deep, deep, deep thing there. And in a lot of these traditions, what's the one thing you do if you want to get enlightened is just remember awakeness. So remember the source, remember, if it's dualistic, remember God, just continuously, just remember. That's the only thing you need to do. So I don't know. I find all this fun and fascinating. And if nothing else, just the meditative practice of memorizing a long text and then just sit down and just recite it, maybe recite it over and over, is really fun.
Well, that point about love brings us full circle, because our shared interest or shared reference to Giordano Bruno, he said that the entire universe is built of love, and he cast his mind to reflecting on infinity, which is, love reductio ad absurdum, I guess. Like he's just really cast it to an unending just bounty of love in all directions that you can possibly imagine. So,
oh, beautiful.
That was a good
praising God, right?
Yeah, well, and good for you to bring it to that point. So thank you very, very much for the discussion and sharing your experience with memory and meditation and science and these different traditions that you're so aware of. And what's coming up next for you, and where can people find your delightful projects that are available?
Thanks. If you really feel like getting into the deep end of, some different types of meditation, then, the main place to start is probably the Deconstructing Yourself podcast, where I interview a lot of people who know what they're talking about on that topic. And also interviewed you, Anthony, about memory. And so that's a good place to start, Deconstructing Yourself podcast, but also Deconstructing Yourself website and all that. You can see all kinds of stuff where have online courses and retreats and stuff for people who want to go in this direction.
Wonderful. And it's a fantastic resource. So thank you for all that you do to bring us so many conversations and your own experiences. It's an absolute gift.
Thanks. And I have to say, I'm blown away by the amount of free material you have online and how useful it is. And so I really appreciate that. And again, thanks for having me on your show.
One of my mantras is, and I admire for you doing it as well, push the free line. So, thanks for being part of that mission with your own work.
All right, Anthony. Good to talk to you.
Well, I want to thank Michael again for this incredible journey into the profound, deeply rewarding connections between memory, techniques, meditation, and human experience. And his insights into using Mary palaces for mantras and rituals really, really helped me think through some of the tensions that I feel between so-called spirituality and science and skepticism. And so Michael has given us so much to reflect on. Make sure to check out his Deconstructing Yourself podcast, books like The Mindful Geek, and I highly recommend that book in particular, as well as his amazing books that he talks about and shares on his website for Deconstructing Yourself. And he's going to help you embrace both the light and the dark sides of meditation so you never again have to shy away from the growth that's available to you starting right now. And speaking of right now, thank you for listening to this episode, being part of it, and hitting that thumbs up and being subscribed, leaving reviews on iTunes and wherever you listen to this material or wherever you watch it. And, share it around if you think you know somebody who might benefit from this kind of material, these kinds of discussions, these fascinating insights that come out of them. And until next time, keep exploring, and above all, keep yourself magnetic. And if you want another interview that gets into these kinds of realms, check out the time that Nelson Dellis and I played remote psychic, and I tried to have him read my mind. The results might just surprise you.